next we have Matt Sakakeeny. Matt is our relatively new music history columnist. I believe this is his 4th column in this issue. He's lived and worked in New Orleans since 1997, and he's currently a professor at Tulane University. His research explores the intersection of music with race, economics, and politics, and particularly the performance of African American music. And he has a book coming out this fall called Roll With It, The Brass Bands in the Streets of New Orleans, which we will certainly be excerpting, I'm sure, later this year. He's written for such journals as Ethnomusicology, Black Music Research Journal, and Current Musicology. And he's going to discuss a topic that is definitely in the buzz right now in our own city. He's going to talk about noise regulation, but not just what's going on currently in that debate, but what has always been going on in New Orleans, all the way back to Congo Square, actually. So without giving any more details, I'm going to welcome Matt Sakakeeny to the stage. Matt.
All right, everyone, how's it going? Yeah, I'm really excited to be the music columnist for Cultural Vistas, and in my first year I wanted to take on a topic that was current and that was on a lot of our minds, but also had some depth to it, and I'm trying to provide some context. So this is this current debate that's going on over the revision of the noise ordinance in New Orleans, which is also tied into other issues around permitting for venues and alcohol and live music, entertainment, and other kinds of entertainment as well. And when I say context, I'm thinking of 3 things. One is that this is by no means a New Orleans problem. I think all cities currently and in their recent past have been confronting noise ordinances around whether it's just noise pollution or live music, recorded music, venues, all kinds of other things. People in every city in the world want to go out and hear music, and people in every city in the world don't want to live next to a place that has music or any kind of noise going into the sleeping hours. So the one question would be then, well, what are the terms of the debate in New Orleans that might be different from some of those other places? I'll talk about that in a little bit. A second would be that in terms of music in general, whether or not we hear something as music or whether or not we hear it as noise is entirely subjective, right? If we're out at the party and it's 3 in the morning and there's a girl next to me and the beat's happening, it's happening music, right? If I'm, again, in the apartment across the street and the venue has its doors open and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm hearing it as noise. I think that's a universal as well, and I think that should ideally bring some sort of balance to the extremes of the debate. And then the third context I'd like to provide, and that I'll be spending most of my time on, is history, because this issue is raging right now, but it has a very, very long, deep history. David mentioned that in the slavery period, when New Orleans was really unique from the rest of the United States, not only because we were a French colonial city initially, but also because of the French colonial approach to slavery. Slaves were permitted to gather in Congo Square on Sundays, and the very short and targeted version of this is, of course, they made music there in the form of what we call the ring shout. And, oh, I have a picture somewhere, right, a famous illustration of this. What do I hit to get the image up?
Right click on the mouse.
Oh, right click on the mouse, okay. Next.
I mean left.
Okay, good. The next speaker will walk right up and have it all ready to go. It's going on stage. So this famous illustration of the ring shout in Congo Square, I could do a whole talk just on this illustration. I'm really fascinated by it and done a lot of research on it if you want to ask me about it afterwards. But of course, this is the foundation for so much New Orleans music. Is just the capacity for black slaves to be able to congregate and make music amongst themselves. one of the most famous, if we can call it account or memory of Congo Square, comes from the great jazz clarinetist Sidney Bechet from the 7th Ward, and he remembered his grandfather Omar talking to him about the slave dances, and I'll quote Bechet briefly before I move on. He'd hear drums from the square, first one drum, then another one answering it, then a lot of drums, then one voice, then a voice, one voice, and then a refrain, a lot of voices joining and coming into each other. And all of it having to be heard, the music being born right inside itself, not knowing how it was getting to be music. And I love that sort of constant incantation of music, and that account jives really well with this drawing of Congo Square, because we get a sense of the sort of insularity and of the ring, right, and the way it invited people in and allowed African culture to be regenerated in the New World. However, and that's sort of our historical memory of Congo Square, right? But by no means was this the overall view of the activities at Congo Square at the time. So the most famous account of Congo Square comes from the diary of Benjamin Henry Latrobe, very famous account when he visited here in 1819 to try to deal with our sewer system, which is one of the many 200-year problems in New Orleans. He described the activities in the square, I'll quote him, a string calabash made, quote, a considerable noise. A cylindrical drum made an incredible noise. A square drum made an abominably loud noise. He called these instruments dull and stupid and brutally savage. And this is just absolute garden variety descriptions of so many African ritual ceremonies from the period of slavery, whether in the New World or in Africa, right? Very, very common, but interesting to juxtapose those in terms of the noise debate. And I'll talk about how the continuity of the noise music debate continues today, but obviously the parameters have radically changed, so don't think I'm going somewhere where I'm trying to talk about 21st century slavery. I want to make a joke about Angola, but I think I'm not quite nuanced enough to do that, because it would have to be nuanced, and I'm not capable of it. What happened in Congo Square was a series of laws to silence it and close it down, right? This is the unspoken story of Congo Square. In 1808, so the Americans come in 1803 and they start what I call the unfinished colonization of New Orleans. Today, still unfinished. They're still trying to make this American. But in 1808, so of course the Americans arrive in 1803, take over the government. The first police code forbidding, quote, to shout or sing a loud obscene song, or in short, to do anything that may disturb public tranquility. Eventually, Congo Square activities are shut down in 1845, about 17 years before the Civil War. And by 1856, in between, when there's a real clampdown, it was unlawful for slaves to beat a drum, blow a horn, or sound a trumpet. So one question I would have is sort of like, where's that history when we imagine the significance of Congo Square today? The significance of Congo Square, if I need to point it out, would be, for instance, well, we're building a national jazz historical park purposely on the grounds of Congo Square, right? We named the African world music stage at Jazz Fest Congo Square, right? There are a lot of these invocations of it. So that would be one question. Jazz itself, to jump ahead to the early 20th century, followed a very similar trajectory. So for instance, and I wrote about this in my second column. This is the cover for a late 19th century, what I think we can safely call a sort of Voice of the Redeemer party in New Orleans. You think does that jive? Yeah. During after the failure of Reconstruction, during White Redemption, the mascot was one of the major organs, voices of that party. And so on the cover here, an interesting sort of cultural version of that political stance would be these black musicians playing up on the balcony along Canal Street, which is of course subject to segregationist laws in this period, and the sort of white bystanders being assaulted by their music, and within the piece, the editorial, I'll quote, and of course this language is historically specific. Several coons armed with pieces of brass were inflicting torture upon this suffering community. And again, early 20th century laws passed, especially in Storyville, to limit the instruments, the types of instruments, the number of instruments, and their proximity to the door, right? So that one particular history, legal history, does seem relevant today. And again, it points out this continuity of this problem, but I also want to draw our attention to the massive change, structural, of course. We're not, to move to the current debate, we're not talking, of course, about the slavery period or legalized segregation. We're not, I don't, by my take on it, even talking about an explicitly racial discourse here, though I think there's probably a differing opinion on that. The other change, though, that I think is much harder to perceive, and this is what I dedicated my last column to, this one that just came out that you've got with you, would be New Orleans' identity as a musical city has changed radically since Congo Square and the birth of jazz in 1900, right? And so what happened over the course of the 20th century is New Orleanians became aware for the first time the importance of their city in the music of the world, right? Specifically through jazz, and then subsequently through rhythm and blues, brass band, funk, soul, and one could argue today hip-hop, right? So because that's the change that I would argue has set the context for almost all of us, I'll say us who identify as New Orleanians, to celebrate the history that I've talked about, Congo Square dances, jazz. I think there's almost a consensus among New Orleanians that we're proud of that history. That's a huge change, right? The Latrobes and the mascot editors are now probably, let me skip ahead here. You know, this, ooh, oh no, how do I go back? You know, this stuff is like wallpaper to us, right? Those of us who live here. Like the Jazz Fest logo is a second line dance when we come to the airport. We're jazzed, you're here. This is a Dirty Coast t-shirt that, if anyone wants to buy me that, I don't want that. When the Saints Go Marching In, our team is of course named after the brass band, the spiritual that's not just a spiritual, it's the brass band song that starts the joyous part of a jazz funeral, right? That's why we're called the New Orleans Saints, right? I took this picture here in my house, jazz daiquiris. How do we get here would be one question, right? And I think that's, and how does it relate to the current debate over noise? Well, one argument I would make is that starting in the 1930s and 40s, there started being the first wave of people studying jazz, and scholars like Bill Russell, these are household names, Frederick Ramsey to us jazz aficionados, saying, hey, this music came from New Orleans, we're pretty sure. And it took about a decade and then a revival of New Orleans music for New Orleanians to be aware of that. We can sort of chart that through some institutions that came about. So the New Orleans Jazz Club gets founded by a very prominent doctor, Edmund Souchon, in 1949. By 1958, we have the Tulane Hogan Jazz Archive, which doesn't necessarily seem like a benchmark to some of you, but it was the first time that the Ford Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities recognized that jazz was an art form that needed to be preserved and documented. Preservation Hall, a commercial entity, but specifically bent on preserving New Orleans music, that's 1959. Jazz Fest itself, right, 1969, just the very idea that you could have a festival based on local music and culture. And that coincided or was even enabled by a huge economic shift in the city away from the port industry and the oil industry, which were winnowing down in New Orleans, and cultural tourism, right, that really demanded, people don't come to New Orleans because of the weather or it's strategically placed, they come here because it's New Orleans, right, because of this, right, and the food and the architecture. I'm just speaking about music in particular. When our mayor was lieutenant governor, he ran the culture ran CRT, Culture, Recreation, and Tourism at the state level. He commissioned this really interesting report, Louisiana, Where Culture Means Business. It came out 4 days before Katrina. And it became a roadmap for the rebuilding of the city in cultural and economic terms, right? Very, very effectively. In the New Orleans section, there's a lot of study of how music impacts the economy, along with film too. Nothing can really touch film economically the way it impacts the city, but all of our entertainments and cultural forms, right? I forget what I was going to say, so I'll just move on to, this would be another example. These are two advertisements that came out. I think the one on the left is in 2010, and this is the one that's currently running now. I'm actually very, very balanced about the music noise issue. I really try not to take sides. I will point out that this slogan is very funny. No, America, we will not turn that music down. Considering the current discussion and debate, that there is some irony that has to be pointed out there. And in this image too, this is a brass band parading on Bourbon Street, right? This is how the city sells itself. These ads don't run in Louisiana, so sometimes we don't see. Well, I mean, they don't have to. We know what we've got. But I guess I think we could linger on this image on the left for a minute, because it seems important to point out that you can't actually do that, right? There's certain hours in the day, I think up till 8 p.m., when you're allowed to parade on Bourbon Street with the brass band, and then you can get a permit for, say, a wedding parade or some other permit, but you're no longer allowed to set up camp. I'm not suggesting that's what's going on in that photo, but the irony of brass bands actually being arrested for performing on Bourbon Street when the city is selling itself off that. I think, for it, if nothing else, those on the music side of this debate that think there's a grand conspiracy to end, that like Mayor Landrieu and people are getting together to close music in New Orleans, y'all are crazy. There's no one that has it together enough to do that kind of conspiracy here. What's clearly going on is whoever is running this, is completely in a position of power that's radically removed from the TBC brass band or whoever else getting arrested on Bourbon Street. This was the quality of life officer handed them this summons, and actually it was very balanced. He did not threaten to arrest the musicians. It's not this is not a Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader scenario here. This is like, you've got to move on. This is what the current noise ordinance is on the books, and so to get to it, the noise ordinance is currently being drafted. Oh, the Facebook page in support of the band, I just wanted to point out, has 22,000 likes, which is, I'm pretty sure 22,000 more than my Facebook page has. And some people have claimed a war on music. This was a joke I made earlier. I don't think that holds water. Here's the noise ordinance, which I think, what did we say earlier? It's 1956, yes. Right? It's been on the books. On one side of this debate, and I don't think this, the point I want to make at the end is I don't think this debate has necessarily extreme sides, but there's a lawyer in the French Quarter named Stuart Smith who founded the organization Hear the Music, Stop the Noise, and he's been he's instigated a lot of litigation against entertainment venues. And then member, and we have another member in our audience of Vieux Property Owners and Residents Association. In the revision process of the city's noise ordinance that's going to go in front of the city council, they gave a set of suggested sort of talking points. And then there's also some musicians-based organizations who have developed their own set of talking points. So I'll just point out, this is MACNO, Music and Cultural Coalition of New Orleans, a noise ordinance for all New Orleanians. And I know you don't have time to sit and read these, but one of the things that's striking to me is that both sides agree that there need to be some type of regulation, and there's actually a fair amount of common ground in between the two proposals. And then the other thing, just to wrap up, that I'll point out is that, of course, the very intensity of debate, just as living proof of what I've been talking about, the significance of New Orleans music in the 21st century that accrued over the course of the 20th century itself. So when MACNO and their the Musicians and Cultural Coalition of New Orleans, they, to quote them, empower the New Orleans music and cultural community through collective self-representation. But on Stuart Smith also, he's not trying to kill the music. I'll quote him, preserving the music culture of New Orleans is at least rhetorically how he refers to that in his blog. I think I should end there. I think we're getting low on time.